Today's video presentation is brought to you by Crazy Tracy's Health Spa, home of Crazy Tracy's secret medicine that'll really pump you up. Her words, not mine. For a mere 42 rupees or less, you could get this potent potion that'll double your lifespan, no joke. Buy one and you may even be eligible for free healing. Hell, if Crazy Tracy finds you to be cute, you might even get a discount. Crazy Tracy's Health Spa, offering premium service at affordable pricing. Which is more than what I could say for some other so-called nurse charging premium pricing for shit service. 400 fucking coins. Fuck right the fuck off. The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, released in 1993 for the Nintendo Game Boy, is the fourth major title in the Legend of Zelda series. Not counting those CDI games that nobody's ever heard of. Later down the road, Nintendo would release an updated version for the Game Boy Color dubbed Link's Awakening DX, which includes a new dungeon, a new printer gimmick, and color, as well as a couple fixes here and there. And for a while I was on the fence as to which version I was going to cover before I decided, you know what, fuck it, let's just do both. And so today it's the Game Boy Original, which is one of the games featured on the Zelda Game & Watch thing. Then we'll do DX, which eventually made it to the Game Boy Nintendo Switch Online Service gimmick that debuted earlier this year. And we'll finish off with the Switch remake. At least that's the plan. We'll see if it actually goes to fruition. Link's Awakening has our hero stranded on the island of Koholint, which has its own cast of kooky inhabitants as well as some familiar-looking monsters and such. To escape this island of dreams, Link must acquire 8 instruments to wake up the windfish and prevent the nightmarish creatures from running rampant. Those who know the deal, and those who don't, well, you just have to see for yourselves now, won't you? But regardless, this is a stock overhead 2D Zelda adventure, albeit one more in line with the first Zelda game on the NES, in that you're moving from screen to screen as opposed to having any scrolling in the game. Fortunately, the gameplay is up to the standard of A Link to the Past, though some concessions and compromises had to be made in order to make this adventure work on the Game Boy. For example, you could swap out items for both your A and B buttons, which means your sword is an inventory item, and it's entirely possible and sometimes necessary to shelve that trusty blade in favor of some other combination of items that will prove more useful. And what a collection of wares you'll be encountering here. Magic powder with different effects, Rock's Feather which lets you jump, power bracelets to let you pick up things and chuck them, hook shots, wands, bows, arrows, bombs, and a shovel to dig up stuff, and go on a wonderful fetch quest for seashells scattered throughout the island, of which there are 20-ish, and once they're all collected, then you get a fancy new sword that's slightly stronger and can shoot sword beams at full health, because otherwise you're stuck with the one sword you picked off the beach, and you will like it. So while control feels a bit compromised at first, once you get the hang of it, it actually works pretty well. Fairly smooth, and the ability to swap both A and B button slots allow for some interesting combinations that could help you in a bind, such as the shoe feather combination that lets you leap across great distances, or exploding arrow bombs. These are actually quite useful to learn as they could help you get farther in the game, or just uncover some helpful secret items such as heart pieces and such. Link's Awakening is also not quite as open as its predecessors, at least not early on, as most of the dungeons are closed off by specific keys you need to uncover, and most of the time, getting those keys require the triggering of story events that usually entails clearing some dungeons beforehand. Once you start clearing those dungeons and acquiring more tools, You do have a little more leeway in how you progress, which is nice because there are seashells and heart container pieces for you to uncover, but there is also a clear sequence of events that the game wants you to follow, as clearing dungeons will also enable those key story events to move the game's plot forward. There's also a trading side quest, something that would become a frequent recurrence in later Zelda games, I'm told, where you're getting items for people and exchanging them for other items to give to other people, which they will trade for other things, which will eventually lead you to getting the magnifying glass, which turns out to be a key item necessary to solve the riddle of the windfish. But to sort of justify this being a side quest, the magnifying glass will also reveal a cave-dwelling Garaya by the beach who will exchange your B button item for his boomerang, which is an overpowered weapon of mass destruction on this island of dreams. No, seriously, this boomerang is so goddamn overpowered it's ridiculous. We went from a wooden thing that can only kill a couple bats and blobs at most to taking down nightmares in a couple of hits. Who needs a fucking level 2 sword? This boomerang gets the job done way the fuck better. But I digress. That's not to say there isn't optional stuff to do. There's a fishing minigame where you could bag some fish and win some money that isn't really worth it, to be honest, other than one of the big fishies has a piece of a heart and clearing out the pond only means a marginal boost in funds. There's the crane game where you can try your hand at nabbing an item. Also not entirely worth it because the prizes aren't worth a damn. You're really only playing this for the Yoshi doll and that's it. The only minigame I ever find myself playing often is the rafting minigame where you ride a raft down some rapids and you try to nab all the floating prizes. It's also the most costly one at 100 rupees, but with the right tools and a good sense of direction, it's also a good place to stock up on rupees, bombs, arrows, and other things. Link's Awakening isn't exactly the smoothest running game either, as there'll be instances where the game will start chugging with slowdown, particularly in the cemetery where moles will start appearing and crapping on the performance, but there were other instances where the game would just slow to a crawl. This is stuff that they fixed for the DX release, so this threw me for a loop because if you only played the color version and then you're going backwards, there's a lot of things that will throw you off because the later version has some fixes that makes the game run a little smoother. So running into stuff like this, these are usually signs that entail a sloppy game falling apart at the seams. But Link's Awakening is anything but sloppy. If anything, it's one of the tightest games to grace the Game Boy, pushing the little brick to its absolute limits to create an adventure that, despite its limitations, is almost as fulfilling as the 16-bit Link to the Past. Hell, I'd argue that the narrative in this game is more satisfying and compelling than the other game, with some characters being spotlighted, some relationships being forged, and some hard soul-searching being implied, especially towards the end. At the very least, it's something different plot-wise, and there's enough charm to these kooky side characters you'll encounter that makes your quest emotionally charged if you know the big twist. Control is something you have to get used to at first, especially the concept of not having a sword and shield on hand at all times. Not to mention the constant need to swap items is a bit of a pace killer, but even with hardware limitations and lack of buttons, the controls work exceptionally well. They're solid, responsive, and smooth. Combining items is something you'd have to do in order to progress, but opens up more possibilities that you didn't have before. Bomb arrows, for example. The action also holds up, boss fights are creative and intense, some of the recognizable tools made the transition quite nicely, and while the game reverts to moving from screen to screen rather than scrolling about freely, Koholint is not some smallish overworld that you'll easily traverse in a single sitting. This is a deceptively huge island with lots of unique scenery, secrets abound, and of course, a lively community that enjoys the outdoors. There's even some side view segments that you'll need to traverse in the dungeons that are reminiscent of the Zelda 1 passages, but these are more varied and are usually populated by a rather familiar cast of foes. There's a couple of gripes to be had with Link's Awakening. Besides the slowdown, which is mostly technical and there's not much you could do with that, I suppose, the game seems to love its text boxes, as you'll get one every time you approach a block that requires some item that is not in your possession, or at least not assigned to a button. It's fine for the first couple of times when you don't have the items, but when these same notes pop up later in the game, that becomes an issue. Same goes for the temporary power-ups that a defeated foe will usually drop, the Triforce-looking piece of power, which temporarily boosts your sword's power, and the Guardian A-Cord, which temporarily boosts your resistance to damage, will immediately greet you with a text box letting you know what it does every single damn time. It's one thing if you're opening a chest, that's fine, you need to know what's inside the chest, but on the field, no thanks. I also don't care for the 5-second ditty that plays while either of these power-ups are active. Finally, no armor upgrade, really? I'm stuck with the default tunic from start to finish? That's kinda lame. I don't mind the sword upgrade being optional. Hell, you're probably better off getting the boomerang and just sticking with that, which is such an overpowered piece of business. It may as well be the Zelda equivalent of a BFG. Sure, you'd lose the shovel. I'm assuming you're trading the shovel for the boomerang. But by that point, you're probably not going to need that thing anyways, so what does it matter? Link's Awakening is a splendid looking game, making a fair attempt at recreating the general visual presentation of the SNES Link to the Past within the constraints of the 8-bit monochrome Game Boy. The scenery matches up with that style exceptionally well, and there's a fair bit of detail to be found here. Not only can you cut away bushes, but also patches of grass. Link himself is also modeled after his 16-bit counterpart, and they've nailed as many of those animations as they could quite admirably. Even the smallish characters are nice looking, with some of them packing quite a bit of charm and personality, a step above those stoic mannequins of the original Zelda. And of course there's cameos from other Nintendo characters, ranging from the blatantly obvious to the more deep cuts, for example. Link's Awakening also sports some wonderful sounds. Sound effects are more than adequate, including some familiar jingles, some attempts at recreating some sound effects and imitation voice grunts from the 16-bit game, and some general sounding sounds. And of course, to the surprise of no one, there's also a great soundtrack to complement the adventure. Link's Awakening would be the first game, I believe, to introduce different dungeon themes instead of having one consistent dungeon theme throughout, and some are variations of a similar theme while others are haunting melodies that heighten the suspense. You have the usual remixed overworld theme to greet you, a couple of them actually, as Venturing into Tal Tal Heights boasts its own take on the tune, and probably my favorite interpretation overall. There's a wide variety of music to be found here, from the upbeat to the heroic to the morose, and it's all wonderfully composed stuff that complements the game rather nicely. It's another example of people using relatively low tech to create some truly exceptional pieces of digital music. To the surprise of absolutely nobody, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is a splendid piece of business on the Game Boy, having seen a couple knockoffs trying to ape its style and then coming along later to show them how it's really done. Changes were made to make up for limitations, and there are some quirks that hamper the game to a degree, but Link's Awakening is neither compromised nor scaled back. It is just as enthralling and exciting an adventure as those that came before, with its own twist on things that made its mark on how business is done. Link's Awakening is one of the highlights on the Game Boy library, and if you haven't played this one, you owe it to yourself to give Link's Awakening a shot. Just not this version, because there's a color version that came along later that's even better, and guess where we're going next? Actually, you don't have to guess. I told you at the beginning of the video where we were going. Pay attention, for fuck's sake. Good night.